Hello and welcome to another installment in the video series by the musicians of the Yakima Symphony Orchestra, Music from Home. My name is Jeff Snedeker. I'm the principal horn of the orchestra, and the subject of this video is a sort of follow-up to a previous video called The History of the Horn. This picks up where that video left off. That video talked about the horn or all brass instruments as beginning their existence as signaling devices and gradually working their way forward. Where we stopped was where the horn had established itself as the sort of sound associated with hunting in culture. So we have terms like hunting horn and even hunting music, where songs were composed to reminisce about hunting adventures, and horns played music that was reminiscent of the hunting calls associated with positioning and deploying hunters and communicating between different members of the hunting party as to what animals are involved and who's going to shoot first and that sort of thing. So, and it was a very sort of complex and rich set of traditions. And so the next question, of course, which is the subject of this video, is how then did the horn move from this hunting tradition into the orchestra? And how then did things transpire from that point on? If you remember, the instrument that we stopped with was something called a hunting horn, and it looks like this. This is a sort of a compromise between something called a Parforcehorn, a very large hunting instrument, or an instrument used for hunting that could handle the fanfares, certainly, and also smaller hunting horns that could have a little more piercing sound if it seemed necessary. This instrument was, again, a compromise between the two, both in terms of size and in terms of its shape. And it was also well designed for playing these, not just the hunting calls, if necessary, but also the hunting songs. So if we hear right, that sort of boisterous, sort of celebratory stuff. And of course, because we've had lots of movies with hunting music in them, right, stuff like that, it's all very exciting. And so it's easy for us to understand that. So then the question becomes, again, if that's where we are in terms of our, sort of or our little video adventure here, what happened next? Well, what happened next had an impact on all of music history. And what we're talking about is right around the year 1600 and the creation of, or the appearance of, something that we now call opera. Opera. In opera, you need to have a storyline. Well, it's a better opera if you have one. But the point of this is that many of opera stories have some sort of hunting event in them, whether someone's hunting other people or hunting animals as a sort of respite or a symbol of aristocracy or just something like that. And so as a result, hunting horns were brought in and played, sometimes even on the stage as part of the sort of plot, just to make noise, not necessarily to get otherwise involved in the plot. That'd be a little weird. But what happened was people began to not necessarily expect them, but felt comfortable having them there because of the sort of atmosphere that they created and added to. And so as a result, people liked not only having them in the orchestra or on stage for the hunting scenes, but they even liked having them there for music in general, because horns can, make some loud noises, and so as a result, they can support the orchestra and make the orchestra louder, particularly if the drama calls for that. They can make pretty sounds when called upon to do so, and so as a result, pretty flexible, and just people like them. So they wound up doing more and more and more work, which is great, at least for the horn players. So as a result of that, though, and the increased use, instrument makers and players began exploring more refined designs and other techniques. One of the next steps looks like this. This instrument right here. You can see it's got a lot of the same shape. Well, I just took it apart. Oh dear. It's got a lot of the same shape, same sort of shape to the bell, but it has a part that I just took off. Now, realize that instrument that I just set down, that hunting horn, could certainly be played in an orchestra, but it was restricted because it had just a fixed tube length. It was restricted to notes that fit within the key, or a few related keys, in terms of the harmony that the composer would choose to write. So what people discovered was that if you wanted to change keys or play something in a different key, you either had to have, you started out by having to have more than one instrument. And that could get pretty expensive. Not to mention, lots of stuff spread out if you could only see the floor of my office right now, you would, anyway. So the idea of having lots of instruments to play in lots of keys, not very practical, but they discovered interchangeable parts. So if I need to play in a specific key, I can put in the piece of tubing that fits, and if I need to change, then I get another part. And I take this one out, and I put this one in, and now I'm in a different key, as called for in the score. And composers got really good at this. But if you listen to the difference here, kind of a bright sound, little hunting horn type. I put in the shorter piece of tubing. I'm going to get higher notes. Right, so that might be useful if the composer needed to go to a different key, right? So I could actually participate. These are called crooks, and they were very useful and very, very popular once they kind of worked out all the details for the horn. Now, the next thing that happened is an instrument that looks like this. Very similar. I'll put a crook in it, so you can see that. And you'll notice that this has just one sort of additional detail. This thing right here. This is, it's a little bit stiff, but this is called a tuning slide, which means I can use the crook to change the key, but I can use the slide to shorten and lengthen the tubing to bring it better in tune. And this instrument was popular starting in the 1700s. That's when they figured out how to deal with or machine the metal to create the slide that didn't leak too much. And so we had that going. So we've got, everything is refining, right? Well, in the first half of the 1700s, people were still improving and in all the different areas of, in terms of string instruments and wind instruments and so forth. And one of the big concerns that people had was horns, same for trumpets, but horns too, had these moments where it was just too loud. Just too loud. They wanted them to be able to participate, but not to dominate the sound, right? And so as a result, and just a couple of horns could drown out a relatively small orchestra. So people began experimenting with trying to figure out how to deal with that. And what they did was they began, this, by the way, this was true of other instruments like the oboe, for example, too. But brass instruments, much more necessary. We'll use that word. What they did was they started putting stuff into the bell of the instrument to kind of muffle it. And what they learned was that could actually work depending on the material. Some material was good. Putting a bunch of wool socks in there, not such a great idea. But other materials, like hollow things, like a bottle or something like that, could actually sort of work. So they experimented with that for a while. But what they also discovered was this, that if you introduce something into the bell, something else happens besides the change in the tone. So not only do we get a change in the color, the tone itself, but we also get a change in the pitch. This has good and bad, right? The good is I can change pitch. The bad is I have a difference in tone color which may not be desirable. So what happened next? Well, not having any more alternatives, the players began practicing like crazy these hand positions to try and even out the tone color. And they got to the point where they were actually pretty good. So they could actually become almost chromatic, being able to play all the notes by manipulating the hand. Was it perfect? Not by any stretch of the imagination. People still complained about why. But a growing number of people began to realize that the change in the color of the, especially when it was done with a good level of accomplishment and refinement, actually resembled the sound the voice makes when we change vowels. So it actually became quite desirable to use the horn, albeit effectively, not just gratuitously, to use it as a fully participatory chromatic instrument. It worked great in certain circumstances when it was featured as a solo instrument or perhaps in a small group, a chamber group. Not so happy was the hand position in the larger orchestra, especially as the orchestra got larger and larger and larger. This is the instrument of Mozart, of Haydn, of Bach, and of Beethoven. And so this is the instrument that they wrote for, and it makes a lot of sense when you listen in terms of how the horns are used and when they get solos and when they definitely don't, such that it's kind of, again, it's good to know, right? By 1800, however, and certainly through Beethoven's life, as orchestras got bigger, the desire for a bigger and bigger sound, or at least more variety in sound, more chromatic movement, more notes, wider ranges, things like that, really put this instrument sort of on the defensive. People still pursued it. They liked the idea of the different colors as sort of reminiscent of the voice. And some regions, particularly in Paris, that folks became extremely accomplished at this, to the point where the next evolution was actually delayed a bit because people were so good at this. So what is the next evolution? Well, wouldn't it be great if we know that crooks changing give us different combinations of available notes? Wouldn't it be great to be able to change crooks faster than, where is it? And then try and get a new piece, a new crook in, get your mouthpiece back in, and keep playing. Wouldn't it be great? As a matter of fact, many people said that in a variety of language. Wouldn't it be great to be able to do that? And there are some really interesting designs that instrument makers came up with in that first 20, 30 years of the 1800s to try and solve this problem. It wasn't just for horn, it was certainly for other instruments too, but it was much more prevalent in terms of the experimentation for horn. They tried things like keys, like you see on a saxophone. They sort of worked on trumpet, but and definitely worked on larger instruments, but for some reason they didn't work very well on the horn. I mean, there are acoustic reasons for it. It's not just weird, it just didn't work very well. They even tried to add slides to the horn, which if you look at the way it's designed, not that happy in terms of trying to make that work. But before I show you what the solution was, let's take a look at some of the experiments that people tried. I'm going to put some pictures up here, and you can take a look at those. Pretty interesting and extremely imaginative. Wasn't that something? How about that one that looked like a rib cage? Isn't that wild? Okay, so those experiments are evidence, if nothing else, they are evidence of a whole lot of interest and activity, trying to figure out what to do next. And what did happen next, the best thing that could happen, was the invention of a device that is related very, very much toward indoor plumbing. The idea of figuring out how to deal with tubing. And here is that answer. This is a detachable version of what happened. I'll show you a more permanent version in just a moment. They actually had these. You could put them in your horn without valves and then take them out if you didn't like them. Or you wanted to use the hand position and stuff like that. Okay, so these are called valves. And what they do is just like what plumbing does. If I push this one down, it adds this much tubing. Oops, I'll get there. And lowers the pitch just as if I put in a longer crook. This one here, this one here lowers it a smaller amount, right? Or lengthens the tube a smaller amount. And just by adding this little piece of tubing right here, and you put the two together and you get, okay, so these were very interesting, and they were invented during the 2nd century, between 1810 and 1820. At least that's when we see the patents being registered for this mechanism. And when they were attached to the instrument, not inserted, but actually permanently attached, they look like this. So this instrument is actually built according to an actual historical example. These are two valves that are called Stölzel valves, and they work the same way, where stuff comes in the bottom and then goes into the side tubings when they are engaged. And when they're not, it just sort of travels through and wanders its way through. But what these two-valved instruments allowed to happen was this. So now I can play all the notes as open, warm sounding things, and all even. Believe it or not, some people didn't like the fact that we didn't have the color changes. They actually preferred the more vocal approach that the so-called natural horn players did. But in the end, as the orchestra got bigger and bigger and bigger, this was the instrument that could actually keep up with it. And they continued to make improvements and added stuff to it to get to the point where we now have this. But all of these little things, the shape, the bell, this thing here, the valves and so forth, all of those have a very long history, some of which is related to the signaling and the early cultural uses of this, and obviously a lot of improvements made for the musical reasons that make the horn such a lovely and wonderful instrument. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this. Obviously, there's a lot of details, like when did they add the third valve? And what's that little thumb thing on the back? And what is that? Why do you have a pencil sitting here? Okay, there are many of these things that are burning questions that need to be answered, but not in this video. We're going to have some more. Anyway, thank you for making it to all the way to the end of this video. I hope you've enjoyed it and maybe even learned a few things. And I look forward to seeing you at a Yakima Symphony concert very soon.